Do you have someone in your life that influences you to be a better person? Or perhaps they lead you down very dark paths, constantly having lasting negative effects? This is At the Root of Knowledge, and in this episode we're going to be talking about influence.
Hello and welcome to At the Root of Knowledge, where we discuss timeless topics. Through conversation, we try to identify underlying principles and assumptions beneath many of mankind's beliefs and ideas. All this so we can find the truth and share what we learn with you. Please keep in mind, we are not experts, and just like you, we're here to learn. I am Daniel Schoech, and with me today is my co-host, Philip Barzik. We have a very special guest with us in the studio today. He has a bachelor's degree in engineering and surveying, a master's degree in civil engineering. He has over 25 years of experience working as an engineer. He is a father of 8 children, and he has been married for 26 years. Today, we welcome Michael Schoech, my dad. How you doing?
Fine, thank you, Daniel. Phil, thank you for asking me to be a guest today.
Well, you're very welcome, and thank you for being here. We're very excited to have you as our first ever guest on the show. So, as we mentioned, tonight we're going to be talking about influence, and I figured we could kick it off with an explanation as to why influence is relevant in a society today, why it's relevant personally and socially. Now, I've broken it down in my head as kind of being influence, your influence on others and others' influence on you. And so one question I had was, should you really let others influence you in a positive way or a negative way? Or can others really influence you in a positive way or a negative way?
Well, let me say this. First, when you asked me to be on your show, I was rather taken as a surprise. But then when I realized it was on influence, I said, "Oh, okay, so they want somebody of bad influence." But no. The question that you posed, the multiple questions there. Can somebody influence, and either negatively or positively? Mm-hmm. And what was the other part of that question? You had asked 2 there.
Should you let others influence you?
Should, right. Can and should. Well, I think it goes without saying that that influence, whether direct or indirect, happens whether a person realizes it or not. It's a part of their nature, whether it's a child witnessing something and they do not realize that they're being influenced, or on a direct influence, or having a friend that says, hey man, let's go out and get some drinks, even though they're only 16, let's go find a buyer or whatever, Right. So there's both influences, I think, that cannot be helped. So no matter where you go, you're being influenced. But should you? Well, that's kind of a deep subject there.
Right. I think in a previous conversation that Daniel and I have had, we came up with the answer sometimes.
Yeah, I mean, sometimes you should let someone influence you. Like if you know that what they're trying to bring to you is something that's going to help you get better. I mean, like, for instance, if you've got a parent that just wants what's best for you, then you should listen and, take their advice to heart and, use it to your advantage. Maybe you're doing something wrong and you don't see it. I know that's many times the case with myself. I don't necessarily realize how offensive I can be, how arrogant I can be, how inconsiderate I can be. And, sometimes it takes somebody else saying like, hey, look it, you've got to change this, for me to see it. So yeah, I think there are definitely times when you should let people influence you. I mean, you said you're always going to get influenced regardless of whether or not, it's just something that's going to happen. And I think that is correct also. I mean, if you got your ears open to listen, it takes space in your mind to even comprehend what someone else is saying. So if you're even doing that much, you're already being influenced by them. So how much? So I mean, how much of that can you let in? I mean, I think the answer is, if you see something that's not congruent with what you think is correct, then you should just try and avoid it. And that's the way to remove the influence, more than trying to filter it out in your own mind, because that leaves room for you making mistakes, and it opens the door for temptation and consideration for something that's, if you know it's wrong, don't let it in the first place.
Now, would you say that's true across the board? Like, if someone was to say something that's partially wrong, should you throw that entirely out, or should you go through it with a fine-tooth comb, finding out what they said that was correct and perhaps trying to learn something from that?
Well, I mean, if you can't say that's incongruent, with something that I know is correct, or that's something that's going to damage me, that's an influence that's going to negatively impact me, or push me to do something that defies my principles. If you cannot point that out and say that's wrong, and maybe even you see, well, there's room to maybe correct an issue here, then I think the appropriate action is to try and understand, and listen. Because sometimes you think someone's agreeing with you. I know it's happened to me so many times, just the person whose words, the person who's speaking is going to have an influence on whether or not I listen to it, and it may be harder for me to not reject it, just because of the person who's saying it. So I think a good place to start is just to try and understand what they're actually saying, insofar as conversation goes. Does that answer your question?
Somewhat. So, in a hypothetical scenario, say someone is speaking out against something that you strongly believe in, and they have a well-structured argument, and you're having a hard time finding a flaw in that, or even finding a way that you can make a counter-argument. Do you think there you should allow their argument to influence you?
Well, you won't. If you're trying to change them, there's no way that they're going to listen to you and try and understand you unless you first try to understand what they're saying. So I guess it depends whether or not you care to. I don't know. What do you think, Dad?
Well, could you ask that question one more time? I was taking notes and I was listening, but I think I missed the main point of what your question was.
So let's say you have a very deep belief in something,
right,
and somebody comes out and starts attacking it, and you don't have anything that clearly, to point at and go, this is why you're wrong. Should you just sit there and take it? Should you let them influence you, or should you say, no, I don't think that's right?
Well, Phil had mentioned the word argument, and an argument is a topic of discussion of two opposing views, at least of a similar topic. Now, that would be a true argument between two people, two countries, or whatever stance they're taking. So a lot of it comes down to what I would see in that argumentative stance is that they have to be based on some form of fact and definition, because only by the words that both parties can agree to that this is the meaning of whatever topic that they're talking about means the same thing. And that's where a lot of the issues that we have now in our lives, especially now in this 2020, we have, because there are so many differential views or opinions of what the definition of words mean, and they let those definitions control how others influence them and how they try to influence other people based on those definitions. That's a lot of what I see. So it's really difficult to have a good argument and have a good understanding when
you're not speaking the same language.
Yeah, when the language that you're talking about are not defining the exact same, do not have the same definitions in their language.
Right, and like maybe there's a bunch of underlying assumptions that the two disagreeing parties have, where you just assume this is correct and someone else just assumes this is correct, and that's the foundation both of them are working off of. Like maybe somebody says feelings should govern behavior, and someone else is assuming principally that, rationality should govern behavior. And if they both, that's where they're sat, they're not going to be able to communicate with each other unless at least one side is willing to understand that maybe rational won't work, or maybe feeling won't work with the other side.
I would not quite to the same point, but you're talking more of an like you said, feelings versus rationality versus consciousness versus a belief system, where I'm talking about actual definitions. Say diversity. 20 years ago did not mean the same thing that it means today.
Right. Maybe diversity 20 years ago meant diversity of opinions or views or perspective, whereas now it could be something different.
It is something completely different. So the definitions of what we have are really a good underlying as respect to how people are taking things and how it influences them.
Well, in that case, since you said definition is important to communicate, I think it might be good to start with a definition so that we're on the same page. What do you think a good influence is?
What I think a good influence is, I think a good influence is the definition of a good influence is somebody that would is an influence that does not. I have to think about this for a second. A definition of a good influence is an influence that will do no harm, kind of like the Hippocratic Oath that the doctors are supposedly supposed to take when they become doctors. So a good, and continuing on that same thought, a good influence will do no harm, will strive to have the influence would be to push the other person to seek and do more good so that they can continue to be a good influence. To recognize the difference between the actions and the thought processes of doing good and being good, as opposed to its opposite.
Okay. So what do you think a bad influence is?
A bad influences would be anything that would inhibit a person from seeing good, doing good, thinking good, as being not just good but well, but no less than neutral.
Now, Father Jenkins, I remember talking to Father Jenkins. He was a high school teacher. He was talking about good versus bad, and he said something that I've thought about a ton. Talk about influences. This was what, 4 years ago, 3 years ago now. I don't know, 3 or 4 years ago, and I've been thinking about it a ton since then. He said he was talking about the difference between good and bad. You know, he said bad isn't so much a thing as it is, you know, the absence of good. So bad isn't its own entity. It's just not allowing.
Right. That is also a definition of evil. Evil is the void.
He might have used evil.
Where good does not exist, there is a void of the good, and that is the definition of evil. That's one of the definitions of evil. The other one is where, like if you have a lame arm, you can't use your arm. The arm is not doing what it's supposed to do, so therefore there is an evil attached to that person, and that's the arm that they can't use because it's not being used the way it's supposed to. It's not acting. So there's another portion of the definition of evil.
Now, going off that same definition, though, wouldn't a neutral influence then, would that also be considered a bad influence? Because it's not doing any good. And so if it's not doing any good, then there is no presence of good there. It's a void of good, so therefore it's technically a bad influence.
And not necessarily. Well, in some aspects, I think you are right. Like when you are supposed to be seeking good, such as you have your studies to do, you're in school and you have a test and you know that you need to study, but yet you're sitting there playing tic-tac-toe or some other game or whatever else like that. The tic-tac-toe is neutral. Whatever it is that you're doing with that may not have any bad or good connotation to it. It just happens to be taking a place of something that should be used for good. But in essence, you are blocking that good with this neutral portion. But that's not really an influence. It's just my scenario here is not necessarily an influence. It's just a scenario.
It's a tool you use to do something not what you're supposed to do.
Counterproductive.
Yeah, it's like a tool to be counterproductive. It's just, you know, the material you use to execute something, I guess, maybe. An accessory.
In speaking of influence, a neutral influence may not necessarily be construed as being evil or good. And I mean, I'm not a person of situational ethics, but the intention of the influence may not have any weight either way. I guess maybe it would depends, and that seems to be a very good word that accountants, engineers, and politicians use all the time. It depends, you know.
Mm-hmm.
I agree. I mean, even when we started out this episode, we kind of started with, well, it depends on what the influence is, whether you should be letting someone influence you. So, do you think that if someone is influencing you in a negative way, or we could even say in a neutral way, should you proactively stop them? Or how should you go about stopping them, if not proactively?
If somebody is influencing you in a negative way, obviously that's a bad influence. So you want to avoid bad influences at all times.
Let me give a scenario then. Say someone in your life who you've known for 4 or 5 years has been, for the most part, a good influence on you, or at least a neutral influence, and now all of a sudden they've started drinking a lot, and they are now inviting you to do the same thing, participate in heavy drinking on say on the weekends when say it's a coworker and he wants you to come and drink with him on the weekends while you're not at work, and it doesn't necessarily affect you at work or affect your performance at work, but it may be taking away from other areas of your life. And maybe he's even a good influence on you at work. Should you then just cut him off and say, well, we are just merely acquaintances at work, and it can't go past that?
Well, I have to go back 30 years in order to do that, to kind of put myself in that line of thought a little bit. Because responsibilities, obviously, and your scenario has a lot to play with it. I mean, if you have a wife and children, and you have other obligations that you need to fulfill, obviously you should not be allowing other influences to dictate what your requirements are for your responsibilities as that parent. Now, as a child or a bachelor or bachelorette, whatever you want to call it, neutral influences can and often do lead to bad influences. It's human nature. So I'm not necessarily advocating saying, listen, we work well together, and that's as far as it's going to go. But the door kind of goes both ways on this. It's like, okay, if you really want to be the better man or woman and say, okay, yeah, let's go out and have some drinks, do some drinking, not necessarily get drunk, but at least be able to have a social conversation, and you can actually have your influence work well on the other person, because during your time together, on your off hours of work, a person can influence the other person that to actually do better with his life.
I think that's a great point. But the thing is, and this is one thing I've been struggling with myself, is, it can be hard for me, at least, to know myself, and know, how far to let it go. Because, it can be very difficult to... Right, you obviously want to be a positive, and you want to be the best influence. Myself, I want to be the best influence on everybody I can. But I've let that get in the way of me knowing for myself, this person, even if I want to influence them positively, they're going to be a negative influence on me, and that can be something that's hard to get away from, with some people. How do I explain this? Drawing the line between trying to help other people and be a good influence on them and help them be a good person, and then, letting them be too big of a part in your life, and to the point where they bring you down, they hurt you, they encourage you to stay up too late, or, maybe talk about people behind their back or something like that.
All right. And usually that's the case, probably 99.9% of the time. That's what happens because of human nature, morbid curiosity, and just our own sinful and evil inclinations. A person will attempt to say, okay, I'm going to be the better person here. I'm going to be the knight in shining armor, the person's guardian angel, whatever one, bring this person to the light, get them out of their drinking habits, and have them turn around. Most of the time, it goes just the opposite way. The bad infects the good, and in order to actually not fall prey to that, is just that. Is not P-R-E-Y, but P-R-A-Y. Yes, because by prayer, that is the main action for anybody who wants to try to maintain the closest relationship to their eternal salvation. And that's really a defining point that a soul does here on earth to help keep them on a good influence, is to pray daily, and eventually pray continually, so that their whole life is one long continual prayer. Getting to that point, well, that's part of the discussion, I think.
Yeah, I mean, on your own, humans are very I'm very vulnerable, and I've found myself in that same scenario way too many times of, I'm going to help this person, and then it does not turn out that way, and it turns out with me feeling bad every time the person's around, because, this isn't doing any good. This is just not helping me, and I'm definitely not helping them, and right, on my own, it's very difficult. So I personally believe, that you're 100% correct. That's, God's the only one that's going to be able to keep you steering in the right direction.
One of the defining things that helped me see the difference in influences, the topic of conversation here, is that all good comes from God. Nothing but good comes from God, and that's where all good drives from. All we are just what I call conduits of that love, of that good. And so the only influence that we can do actually comes to us, and it should be through us. And I know we've had an off conversation about this before, Daniel, and that and you looked at it as more of a managerial leadership role within the and that whole love transmission, transference, transcendence even, of God through us to other people. And that is also what I would see is most important here in this particular topic conversation of influence, and to deliver that same good influence to other people through your actions, through your words, and everything else that you're doing.
Mm-hmm.
So can you allow other people to influence you? Yes, you can. And how would you do that? Well, by willing it, by allowing yourself to dismiss the good if it was a bad influence. Can you allow them to influence you in a good way? Yes, if you are recognizing them, and you allow your will to allow that good influence. Now, should you do that? You should do it with good influences. Yes, at all times. I mean, you know when you're talking with a good person most of the time. You feel good. It sounds good. It sounds pleasant, and that's a sign that there is a definite conduit of that good that is coming through that person, wishing you well and to do better as well. So you're allowing that. And should you allow that? Yes, you should allow that conference of good. Like when you go to Mass or something like that, and you're talking, after Mass or whatever, even before Mass, whatever else like that, and somebody says, God bless you. Somebody that you happen to recognize is going to church or being...
trying to be a good person.
Yeah, and just wishing you well. Yes. I mean, God bless you too. You know that this is a good transference of that love, of that charity. And but most typically, we're not always in that scenario. I mean, that's a short amount of time throughout the entire week.
Right. Well, you mentioned that, well, I guess I'll step back. So, if you're trying to be a good person, you have a good relationship with God, I think things will automatically line themselves up if that's your intention. But a lot of people aren't starting from there. And a lot of times, I think what's standing between you and following what you are supposed to do is yourself. There's a lot of times you are your own worst enemy. And you said this is just you're talking to someone that you sense is good and that comes across as pleasant, and you know that it's a good influence, so you want to keep it going. But I mean, I would argue that depending on where you're starting from, it could be the exact opposite. I've been in dark places I would consider dark, where there's a lot of internal conflict and denial, and hearing something good is grating, So for a while, I believe I did one of my biggest changes over the past year and a half of my life, and I hope it continues throughout the rest of my life, where I just decided I'm not going to allow any of it. I'm not going to let these little things keep popping up. I'm going to go down to the very, very most basic, smallest piece and not allow anything, not be like, okay, well, all this stuff is good, but this little thing is bad. Well, we'll allow that because we enjoy it. And I decided I'm just going to cut all of it out. And I know, especially in the beginning of that transition, one of the hardest things was hearing good stuff. Because internally, maybe deep down, I knew it was true, but on the surface, there was another piece of me that was just absolutely rejecting it, and there was conflict whenever I heard this, and it was to the point where I was telling myself, if it hurts to hear it, you need to listen. And that's what I would tell myself over and over and over and over for a long period. And I don't think I feel that way anymore, but it was for several months. That's what I had to go through in order to even let people positively influence me. So I think you said someone's good. I don't think it's necessarily always pleasant to hear something good, because you got to bring yourself into the equation and the conflict you offer.
Well, and to build on that, I think also something that is bad can also be disguised and pleasant to hear. I mean, you talk about the wolf in sheep's clothing. They can be very pleasant to hear someone talk about how you're going to have a party, and then wind up going there and, for instance, getting drunk, or when you had no intention of doing it in the first place, and there was no intention of someone even being there with alcohol. Or perhaps it's something small, like you and I are having a conversation about Daniel, and at first we have nothing but good things to say about him, and then all of a sudden one of us says, well, yeah, but I do wish he'd be more,
whatever,
insert a virtue here, and then all of a sudden we go off on a tangent on the things that we can't stand about Daniel. I think that bad influences can be very pleasant to hear, and it can be in a wolf in sheep's clothing scenario, if you will.
Yeah. I think you're right there, because a bunch of wolves when they notice that there's one in their pack that is definitely lame and limp, is going to get attacked. And that's pretty much a wolf that's dead. A couple things that struck me, Daniel, while you were talking there as well, that I think many of our influences are due to our conditioning, the influences that we receive and the influences that we happen to give and portray. A lot of it is a lot of parroting that we happen to receive in our formidable years or even past formidable years into middle school, high school, and beyond. And that comes through education, because when a person is going through education, typically a person is being taught something. They have to do something. It is required. If you're going to learn something, you have got to realize that you're seeking knowledge on a certain topic. So therefore, you do not have the knowledge that you want to possess. And what does that require for the person to do? The person has to let down their pride, and they have to open themselves up somewhat to a humility point, and they submit themselves to take in the information and allow themselves to be influenced by what it is that they're learning. And
a question that just came to me then is, can you influence someone who doesn't want to be influenced? Say they're set in their ways, and say you're trying to convert them to be a Catholic, and they are set in their ways, and they think that the Catholic Church is...
Oh, yeah.
You can?
Oh, yeah. All
okay.
the time. In fact, that's kind of one of the things that we're supposed to do in our life here, in our journey on Earth.
Mm-hmm.
Yes.
So, do you think that if you're trying to influence someone who doesn't want to be influenced, obviously that makes it harder, but you think that it is possible to sort of break through that barrier that they've...
Well, our Lord said, by their fruits you shall know them. So if by your actions you are humble, you're kind, you're charitable, you're loving, those are fruits, and everybody will recognize, and people that happen to recognize those fruits said, well, there's something different about this person, because they never speak bad about anybody. They never cause argument. They're always pleasant to talk to. They say hi even though they know that they can't stand the other person, or the person doesn't care for them and they've done evil to them, but yet they still respond and smile and say hi, and whatever form of congeal point of contact is there. So by those fruits, if a person is on opposing views of their belief system, but they happen to recognize what this person does and sees the outcome of what it is that they're doing, or he doesn't even recognize the outcome, but they happen to recognize what it is that they're doing and how they portray themselves, that is an influence. That is a passive influence, and that passive influence is one of the things that people are supposed to be doing in a good way throughout their life. Again, the conduit of love that we receive from God is to give it to everybody else. And that's back to the same point I was making earlier. But what I was talking with respect to a person causing themselves to be humble enough to be able to learn a subject, and especially in our formidable years, mid-school and high school years, junior high and everything. And junior high is one of the worst ones, with respect to, okay, I've learned it, now I'm going to act out. On the other side of this is the pride, and the pride is the root of all evil. It really is, because pride is just not one thing. Pride is not just I'm proud, look at me, look how good I am. Pride disguises itself, and there are many different titles of pride. some people cannot stand to have their feelings hurt. That's a pride of their feelings,
Or to be corrected.
or to even to be corrected. That's another one. I mean, there are many different forms of pride, and everybody has a specific one, and I call it pride because pride is the root of all evil. That is the what they call the controlling passion in that person's life. And once that person finds what that controlling passion is in their life and tries to subdue it, harness it, saddle it, break it, whatever else, they can control it. They're never going to be able to get rid of it, that controlling passion. But they'll be able to direct it to help them and be a better influence. But until a person can do that, it's going to just, no matter, the person's going to be battling it with the rest of their life. And if a person wants to be influenced well, or wants to be influenced poorly, and that controlling pride, that controlling passion will work towards that direction.
Okay. So, do you think then that well, I guess you already answered
Yes,
that.
I do think of that.
I was going to ask a question about whether you should try to eliminate pride or use it to your advantage, but you already answered that question.
Well, yeah, you try to eliminate it as much as possible, obviously, but as much as possible. But for the most, for like I said, there is that controlling passion. So I'm not saying that you don't have any other passions, and I'm not talking about what most people think of when they think of passion, like, oh man, I just love soccer. I can't get enough watching soccer, or whatever the thing is that a person is passionate about. Mm-hmm. I'm talking about a controlling passion that actually drives the psyche of the person. Not just the psyche of the person, but the entire physiological part of that person. The part that causes a person's heartbeat when they start to think about a certain thing. I mean, the heart to increase the rate of which it most normally beats at, or their face to get swelled up and flush with blood because they're getting upset because they're thinking about this certain thing. And nothing's happened, but it happens all inside their head. Mm-hmm. And that's one of the passions. That's not necessarily the controlling passion, but it is a passion. And I'm talking about passions in a negative sense, not passions in a positive sense. I'm talking about the things that we're supposed to try to combat in our lives to saving our souls. Okay. So yes, we try to submit ourselves as much as possible to humility and learn what is good and godly, and try to root out the pride as much as possible, or at least throw a bridle in its mouth and just ride it until it's broken.
Mm-hmm.
You know.
Yeah.
You bring it under submission as much as possible. You're not gonna be able to kill it, but at least you can steer it.
Okay. So one thing I'd like to talk about is the different, I'll say, the different areas of influence, the different things that can influence people. By that I mean, like being kind to them, or trying to manipulate them, or trying to motivate them with, or incentivize them with rewards. Say you're trying to influence one of your workers for your business to perform better. You would tell them, hey, we have a bonus program or something like that. So I'd like to see what both of you think are some different ways some different strategies for influencing people.
I think one of the best ways to influence someone is to show them how it helps them. As far as when you're trying to convince somebody to do something, well, I'd say that's a piece of it. I think actually, let me take it back. The best way, and sometimes maybe the only way, to influence someone is by example. Because even when people will refuse to listen, they're probably still watching. I think that is actually the best way, the most foundational way, because you won't build up a rapport or respect for someone unless they first see that you are who you are, and what you're committed to living out in your life. I think example is the best way to influence someone. Not the only way, but definitely something that needs to be there. Like, if you do not lead by example, who's going to listen to you? Like, what credibility do you have if you're not willing to show that, like, people could have their minds closed and ears closed to listening to what you have to say, but if you only ever put forward a good example for them, then they're a lot more likely to have respect for you. I guess. I think, that is where I would start with someone, like, especially if you're in a relationship with someone, maybe your girlfriend, boyfriend, wife, whatever. You can always set a good example. You cannot always you can't make anybody understand anything, right? But they can always look at what you do and see. I think that's what I judge off. That's one of the biggest things I judge off of, like, as far as letting people influence me, is like, what are they doing? Coworkers at work. Are they always there working? Are they trying to move the project forward, or do they not really care? And they're kind of just like, I'm just here for a paycheck. I gotta look busy, and not have people complain about me. That's the example they set for me, and that's kind of what I go off of. That's what I think employers go off of when they're looking, is the example that coworkers set. And yeah, I'd say that's the best. But as far as, like, if you're trying to tell somebody to change in some way or motivate them to do something, I guess, is to start with, okay, two pieces. One, show them how it benefits them. Don't come at it as, I would really like this, or I would really like X. Like, in marketing and stuff, when you're trying to convince somebody to buy a product, you're never like, we would love you to buy this product because it would really help the company. No. It's like, this product is going to make your life fantastic. You know what I mean? This will make stuff so much easier. You'll be able to be a better person. Look at how sweet you'll look in this awesome ride. Like, dream a new ride, you know what I mean, type of thing. And then, so that's a key thing. And then another key thing is to try and understand the other person. Like, you want to influence, you got to understand the other person. Like, you got to be committed to hearing out what they have to say. They will not listen. They will not ever try and understand you without you first trying to understand them. And, can you really diagnose a problem? This is kind of stolen from Stephen Covey, but can you really, you can't cure a disease without first diagnosing the problem. So you got to get in their head and try and understand it from their head as much as possible. Otherwise, your diagnosis might just be something that applies to just you. You know what I mean? So you've got to understand them, just listen. And like Dad said, swallow your pride. He said that, and I was thinking about books and all the books I've read where it's like, I know this guy's smart, but I don't agree with that. And then it's keeping me from listening to the entire book, and getting their message. And it's just like, just listen, okay? But the same thing applies in conversation. Regardless of what you're thinking, regardless of your past, or like, oh, I've got the answer for that one, or, ooh, I know where they're messing up. It's like, no, why don't you just swallow it, sit there and listen. It doesn't matter if it's a 4-year-old kid. It doesn't matter if it's an 80-year-old person. It doesn't matter if it's a Nazi. Like, if you really want to change them, you got to understand. So, like, whatever your preconceived notions or your convictions are in your own mind, just stop there. Just stop it and just try and understand first before you do anything. Because, for one, you understand them. Try and understand them. They're going to give you the same thing. And then for two, you understand them. Well, then you'll actually understand the problem and you'll be able to provide the best solution, the best medicine. Or maybe you'll realize, wait a second, I don't actually have medicine for this. Does that answer your question?
Yes, in a very roundabout way, I guess. I do think example is one of the best ways to influence someone, although it can also take a very long time to try to influence someone through example, because it does rely on them to be watching your example.
Right. Okay. You're granted there. That works best with like children and spouses and stuff like that. So, and people you're not going to really be able to give, take that long-term approach with example, which, I'll grant you is the case with a lot of people. Then you got to pull out emotions and make them feel. If you only got a short period to influence them, make them care about what you have to say. Stir them up, because, if it's kind of just subtle, it won't leave a punch, you know what I mean? So get them, you hear from speakers all the time, great speakers, they'll try and pull emotions out of people, because then they'll have an invested interest. So you're right there. But I'd say, like, with most people in your life, example, like coworkers and family members and so on. If you're a big political figure, your example goes a long way. Or a big anything figure, you know what I mean? Actors, blah, 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 blah. Everybody's always looking at what they're doing, You can't do anything without it being put under the microscope. If you've got a big enough fan base and, influence. I'm sorry, I just wanted to add that.
No, you're okay. So, to add on to that, there is a book that was recommended to me, and I haven't had the chance to read it cover to cover, but I have had the chance to read a couple articles on it. And it's called Principles of Influence by Robert Cialdini. I'm not sure if I'm pronouncing that right. But anyway, he has 6 principles that he goes over, and in one of them is commitment and consistency, which I believe falls under the category of example. But he has a couple other principles that I think I have used in my life, and that I've had people use to influence me. A big one is reciprocation. That if you've ever had someone, you've gone out to eat with someone and they pick up the check, if you go out to eat with that person again, you feel obligated to pick up the check. Or even if you don't go out to eat with them again, you feel like you owe them something because they've given something to you. It doesn't have to be a area where you're purchasing something. It can be something as small as complimenting something.
Opening the door.
Correct. Yeah, it's just when someone is kind to you in a way, you feel like you want to be kind to them back. You want to return that favor in a way. Another area that he says is a big influencer is social proof and peer pressure, which I've fallen prey to that as well. Prey as in Prey. And especially in high school and in middle school, it's very easy to just follow the crowd and to do what's popular. And I think that can be a positive and a negative influence. I mean, if everyone's going to church every day, everybody's going to daily mass and receiving communion, you do feel a certain amount of pressure if you're not doing that, but you still hang out with that crowd. Because sooner or later, someone's going to ask you the question, "Hey, why weren't you at mass today? Why are you skipping out?" Stuff like that. Another one he says, which this one I'm a little hazy on, and I wanted to ask you guys what you think of this one. He says it's liking, and by liking he means physical attractiveness, similarities, contact with people, cooperation. And so I wanted to ask you, how much in your life, in your experience, how much has others having a liking to you, or you having a liking to others, how much of a role has that played in an influence?
Well, birds of a feather flock together, you know. Mm-hmm. So obviously, if you get accolades in a positive sense, that's going to be a big influence with respect to how you act and react or respond in that manner. So if somebody says, "Boy, man, I like your beard, Phil," and everyone compliments you on your beard, well, I think your beard's staying. So, yeah, I mean, it's kind of hard not to get around those sort of compliments, and that sort of liking, if you will.
Yeah, huge for me. Like if I like someone, like I want to be around them and I want to listen to what they have to say and I want to try and apply the things they teach me. Huge for me at least. Like if I if I enjoy being around someone, or if it's like every time I talk to this guy, he's always trying to encourage me. You know, he's always trying to help me. You know, he's always there to support me. I'm a lot more likely to listen to this person. You know, if they really take the time to like look at what I do and be like recognize the things where I've put a lot of effort and, you know, congratulate me for them or affirm me, you know, I'm a lot more likely to want to be around them, you know, or even if they're just there for an event or whatever, or something that they know is important for me, I'm going to want to do the same thing for them, you know, and I'm going to want to reciprocate that same liking, you know. So for me at least, liking's been huge for influencing me, you know. People where it's like every time they're around me, all they ever do is ask for something, or I feel that way, like it's only ever work when this guy opens their mouth, or it's only ever something I don't want to do, then I don't want to listen to that person, you know. I don't want to, you know, it's very hard for me to accredit them with anything.
So you mentioned not wanting to listen to that person if it's always constantly work. Do you think that's the same across the board if, say, one of your friends or one of your peers was to say, "Hey, we need to get this job done. We need to go work on this machine." Or do you think it would be different if someone who's someone who's in authority, would that have a different effect on you?
I think a lot of it comes down to, like, how good are they, or how good, in a sense, like, is my pride invested in it? Or my passion? Like, is it... Okay, I guess your question is a peer versus a person of authority. how is the question brought to me? You know, is the person in authority like, here you go. Here's an opportunity to prove yourself. I know you got this. Go take care of it. I'm going to be more inclined to do it than if I feel like they're just bringing me a project or whatever and saying, this needs to be taken care of. It's your job. I want it done in this amount of time. The same thing applies to people around me. You know, what attitude do they bring to it? Are they like, we want to do the best we can with this project? You know, they're fired up to just, you know, provide this. I mean, because like school can be fun. Yeah, that I know a lot of people, but it can be. Like if you're with a group of guys that just wants to perform, you know, your hearts out and do something awesome, you know, and I know we talk about pride and whatever, but I don't know a good word for it, and this is something I've been struggling with in my own mind, but that pride of doing well, that feeling of accomplishing something great, like if a peer can bring that to the table, bring that to the topic of discussion, or how do I say it, can instill in you some sort of desire to do something great through your work, then I'm going to be more inclined to do it than if they're just like, we got to finish this project so we don't fail. Then I'm not going to want to do it. Or even necessarily hang out with the peer because I know that they're just going to want to work. If that makes sense. Like if they can make me happy to do it, then I'm happy to do it, regardless of who it's coming from.
Because we all know it's about your feelings and not how it makes you happy or sad.
Absolutely. Hey, I mean, feelings are important. Like I think rationale should govern, you know, your decisions. But I believe feelings are incredibly important, and they're given to you for a reason, regardless of whether or not you'd like to admit it. Sure, you have some control over them, but like if you do not care, then you don't care. You know what I mean? Like the feeling of caring. Dave Ramsey talks about this with money a lot, and I think he makes a great point. Sure, rationally, you save this amount, number. Hey, it stacks up that you have this amount of money and you're able to, but like you gotta feel the money, like you gotta care, you know? So I think feelings are important. Like even if they're not, they shouldn't be your ruling thing. And I think that's where a lot of arguments go wrong, is taking feeling as a governing factor. Like I don't think it's should be a governing factor, but it's important. And like you won't stick to something if you do not feel it.
Well, I think it is important. I believe you're right. Feeling is important. And I would say the greater percentage of people, that is what is most important, is how they feel about it. And that's where their influences most often lie, and how they feel about it, regardless of what their conscience is telling them.
So, on a side note then, do you think that your intuition comes from your feelings, or do you think that comes from your conscience, or a mixture of both?
Your intuition?
Yes.
Well, it's intuitive. Well, I think there is a layer of some psychology that is also brought into it, as far as your intuition, because not everybody has the same intuitions on every subject,
Mm-hmm.
and at every point. But it is, I guess your question is what again?
Where do you think your intuition comes from? Do you think it comes from more from your conscience or more from your feelings? I'm of the opinion that it comes more from your feelings.
I think.
Although I don't think
your intuition actually does not come from your conscious or from your feelings. I think it comes more from your subconscious.
Okay.
Because because something that is intuitive is not something, I would say, that it specifically comes from a delineated line of thinking, that this is your conscience
Right. You don't have a necessary.
There's an intuitive matter to it that is almost
Right.
unexplainable.
You weren't conditioned to think that way necessarily. Right. It's ingrained in you.
Right.
Okay.
It's like the will to survive. I don't have to be told to breathe. I just breathe. All right. It's not part of my conscious level, and it's definitely not necessarily so much my subconscious level, but it just happens naturally. But the intuition that we're talking about isn't just an involuntary action of your beating heart. But I think it comes more. I think the intuition has more to do with your subconscious than it does your conscience or your feelings.
Okay. Kind of moving a little bit away from what we were talking about. One of the, well, arguably, I know in your opinion, probably.
I'm always argumentative. Yes.
Yeah. The biggest influence you have ever is your parents.
Yes.
You know, assuming that you had parents. You know,
I have. Yes.
You know, and that's maybe parents doesn't apply to everyone.
Right.
But when you're young, you know, maybe the argument is, and this is something we can talk about, you know, you're particularly susceptible to allow things to influence you, and maybe even your identity comes from someone else, you know, as a little kid. You're a parent. You've had 8 kids. So you've been, you know, and you've obviously been raised by parents. What is how far are children influenced by their parents? Like, and how much of a role do parents actually play in, you know, raising children? How much is there influence? Huge question, right? But
well, how much do they play in raising children? I'd say 100%. But how much do they play in influencing children? That's 200%.
Right. That's the question I'm more getting to.
Right. And in a traditional sense, yes, a mother and a father and their family. That's the duty of a married couple is to procreate, and not just to pop them out like rabbits, but to actually bring them into and give them back to God, so that they are good stewards of what God has given them, like the talents that were given to by the ruler of a land, and given to 3 different stewards to help the Lord. Well, one guy made 10 more on top of his 10, and the other one made 5 more on top of the 5 that was given, but the other one just buried it in the sand. And then when he came back and find out what he had, obviously the one who gave him the 1 talent back said, "Okay, I'm going to take this. I'm going to give it to the guy who multiplied it by 10, because you're no good." So it's what you're giving back to God. It's because the children are, they're yours, but they're only on loan. You know, they're not yours. You're supposed to give these things back to God, and they better come back to the best of your ability as being something better than they are worse.
Mm-hmm.
So how much does that influence actually does play? Yeah. The most formidable years, the years of 0 to 5, are the most impressionistic years on a child's life. And my dad had often told me that if he was, I don't know if he actually told me, but I've heard him tell other people that he wants to be that person as that new slate enters the world. He wants to be the first person to actually write on that slate, because whatever he puts there for the first 5 years are indelible. Yeah, somebody might come along and try to wipe it off and put something else on there, but still, there's still that ghost image in there that is part of that person's character. And for the most part, this is true. And you find the same thing with people with people that are born in Russia or another country or Mexico or wherever, and they happen to move to another country. If they happen to move to the other country before they turn 5, they tend to take on the accent of the place that they came to, if they came to it before they're 5. After 5, most oftentimes they still have an accent of the place that they came from. I mean, 5, it's right there, right around 5. I mean, given a few months either way, but most typically, that's what you'll find are the most important. And that's just an example of just the accents of people's languages. But influences are definitely paramount, because that is the clean slate that a parent writes on in their children.
Well, okay. What are some... Okay, so it's very important, right? Because it sticks with them for the rest of their life. What are some ways, or is there maybe even a best way, that you should try and influence kids below the age of 5? And what do you put on there, I guess? What do you put on the slate, and how?
Are you talking about your own children or your neighbors?
Your own kids.
Okay, I figured as much, but I just wanted to clarify. Well, it should be the same either way, whether it is the neighbors or you happen to be run a daycare, for children that are too young to go to school. It should be the same regardless. You should be the person that you're supposed to be, wherever you're supposed to be, and the best person that you're supposed to be. So it's not necessarily changing for one circumstance to the next. But what are the type of influences? What are the best influences? Well, the best, the good, better, best sort of influences, if you look at it in an order of magnitude, obviously you want to be the best influence. And one of the best influences that a parent can be to their children is to not allow bad influences. That means no poor use of language during their formidable years. No bad images. No bad entertainment. Obviously, all the good things you need to instill them into them. Prayer is the most important. It is necessary for salvation. That's just, and when I say the word about salvation and the immortal soul and everything else like this, the reason why I bring these up is because this life that we're in is just transitory, as we know. Eventually, we're going to die, and our ultimate goal is to reach heaven. And the best way to do that is in the proving grounds on this earth through our influences with other people. So if we're doing good and influencing well, the chances of getting to heaven are even better. So, and that is taught in the ages of 1 through 5. And the best ways to do that is leading by example,
Right. I was reading a book by Tim Tebow's mom, Ripple Effects, and she talked a long time about little kids and children and how much they hang on absolutely everything you do. They watch you don't even realize it. Maybe you think it doesn't matter. She talks a lot about teaching moments, but she kind of disclaims that by saying every moment is a teaching moment, especially with little kids, because they're always watching what you do. They never take your eyes off of how you behave.
They're a sponge.
Yeah. And they'll bring it up and they'll ask you, because kids generally, from my experience, are pretty open. Yep. I think this, and there's not really a ton of a filter, especially when children are really young. It's like, so you got to defend you do something in front of a kid, you know, if
Yeah, they haven't developed that filter. So there's to them the concept of filter is, well, what's that? Well, who needs that? What would you want that for? You know? Why? When you get to a certain age. So yeah, it is a ripple effect because if you take that handful of dirt with rocks and gravel and everything like that, and you throw it out on a placid lake, every little single grain and rock and stone, everything like that is going to cause a small ripple. Everything.
Right.
And the placid lake is the developing years of a child, especially in the developing years. I mean, yeah, everything you do afterwards will also influence. I mean, just because they have reached 16, it's like, whew, okay, honey, we can calm down now. We don't have to be. It's not that at all. It's the first 5 years are the most impressionable. That's when the most influence is going to be seeded. Now you need to make it grow because, again, they have not developed the filters at that early age, but they have received a bunch. So now, as they continue to develop, you continue on your good influences and developing all those filters, as you just called correctly. And the best way to do it is, yes, keeping bad influences out. That's particularly with entertainment.
Okay. Right. And I think that is correct, because like I can remember a lot of things from when I'm a little kid on TV that I still think about, I still think about. I mean, right, it sticks around, but sooner or later, they're going to have to discern influences for themselves. When, how, what in your opinion, how do you let that, when do you let them have their own judgment, I guess? Do you let them have their own judgment from the beginning and then just only give them a certain amount and then see how they use their own judgment? And, once they get old enough to the point where they're out on their, there's got to be a transition, right? Does it start from the beginning? Do you wait till a certain age and then go, okay, now I'm going to let them use their own judgment? Like, how's that?
No, regardless, I think that a developing child will always test their abilities in their judgment. I mean, when they're 1.5 and they're pulling themselves up into the coffee table or whatever, and they're waddling on their legs and they're trying to hold on and stuff like that, and they reach for your coffee and you go, don't touch that. And they stop and they look at you and they reach for it and they're still reaching for it. Don't touch it. They are already developing those things. That's the judgment calls that they're already testing. I mean, it's nothing new. They're just developing it. They push. They see where the cracks are, where they can make you crumble. They try to tear you down. Now, after 8 children, it does tend to get fun.
Should you let your kids explore that? Or is that a it depends type of a thing?
Well, obviously you don't want to introduce something that's going to come out badly. If it's a glass of water, don't do that. And a kid reaches and pours it on himself and gets himself all wet and looks at you and starts crying. It's like, see, told you shouldn't have done that. I told you no. You may not understand all the words that are coming out of my mouth, but you do understand no, don't touch. Now, if the kid happens to be a little bit taller and have to be reaching up and on top of a stove with the burner going on, are you going to allow them to do the same thing? The answer is probably no, which is good because you don't want the child to obviously suffer burns and really get hurt, and in a very non-fatal way, but still that's a form of a very bad punishment and a teaching tool. I would not suggest that one.
Right. I mean, you can't possibly hope to stop all of them, right? Like kids are going to make mistakes and they're going to learn one way or the other.
Yeah, so they're always making their own judgment calls. And there are, and if you do your job right, which is so difficult with children because every single one of them are different.
Mm-hmm.
You're different from all your other brothers and sisters. Not one of you are the same. So and they're not going to be, carbon copies of you. It's not like a cookie cutter press. They're not like mom. They're not like dad. They're their own particular person.
From a very early age, if I've been able to notice from birth.
Well, yeah. And again, when you're talking about influence, you have to remember that there are also personality types.
Mm-hmm.
And the reason why I bring this up is because that plays an important role in teaching your child and helping them develop correctly so that they learn how to allow themselves by good influences and how they will and allow allow others to influence them in a good way, but how to avoid bad influences and what happens when they are in contact or they come across a bad influence. If you're doing your job correctly, and like I said, that's one of the things that's is recognizing what type of personality type. And when I mean by personality types, I know them most traditionally as either being choleric, phlegmatic, sanguine, or melancholy.
Mm-hmm.
So those are the 4 personality types. And obviously, some people can have many different traits of the different types, but they usually have a predominant,
main one.
Yeah, a predominant personality trait.
Well, so you don't want to introduce a bad influence onto your kid, but you won't have the reins forever. That's not the way it's supposed to happen, and I don't think, like they're going to have to become their own influencer, their own mediator of the influences they allow into themselves. How's that transition period work? Like, does it just happen naturally? Is it something like you need to regulate up to a certain point and then go, okay, now you're good? Or, is it an incremental thing? Is it something that you or is it like one of those things like, well, it just depends on the kid?
No, I'd say it does not depend upon a kid. It's not a situational ethics, and it's not something that is actually going to ever, or should ever be allowed to, to give up your responsibility of being that parent. Yeah, I mean.
Let me clarify what I'm saying.
All right. Well, maybe I'm going the wrong direction, but I'm
right. Well, when do you let them have the freedom to explore on their own what the influences are out there and how? Not so much. Okay, you always want them to have good influences, right? But you cannot always control that, and probably eventually you will have very little control.
Right. Well, like I said, if you do your job right, you won't ever have to worry about it.
Because they'll just figure that out on their own, or they'll know that when the time comes.
Right.
They'll
be able to recognize what is black and what is white. What is good, what is bad.
So you can let the exposure come in.
Right.
Well, not the exposure. You'll let them use their own free will and never worry about regulating exposure because they'll know where not to go.
Well, yeah, and that's the purpose of parenting, is every single child from even before they come out of their mother's belly already has a free will. Mm-hmm. They already have this soul. They already have a personality type that is already there. It's not something that they pop out and all of a sudden they go, do I want to be a phlegmatic or do I want to be a choleric or whatever, sanguine? Yeah, let's party. No, it's not like that. They already are born with that, with their personality traits. They're already born predisposed one way or the other to which were they going to more the proclivity um, um, ascend to. Um, so their free will is already developing, and you're going to you can't stop their free will. You have some children that are good, you have some that are bad. It doesn't matter what you do, it doesn't matter what you say, they're still going to have that pride and push on to do whatever it is they want when they want to do it and however they want to do it. Some people are just hell-bent on going that direction. And that's unfortunate. And I'm not saying that the child did it on their own. Obviously, there's usually some form of an influence in there that was not good. So you're really not handing them the reins, because they always have the reins.
So I'm asking the wrong question.
Right. The child always has their own free will.
Mm-hmm.
They can obey or not obey. They can, they can watch cartoons when they're not supposed to be watching cartoons.
Gotcha. Okay.
Right. Yeah. But when are you going to stop regulating them? You won't stop regulating them, or you shouldn't stop regulating them as long as they live under your rules. The time for you to step away is when they are their own person. Obviously, with their own spouse. Most oftentimes, that the married couple are one. They leave their mother and father, and you're still influencing them, but it's not directly anymore.
Right. A lot of that influence is carried on from younger years.
Oh yeah, right.
Yeah, I mean, I've seen a lot of people, it's like they were never raised, and it's like they just don't get it. Like you can tell when someone, more often than not, in my experience, you can tell when someone didn't have parents there that wanted to raise them to be, at the very least, better people, and it's unfortunate, but I mean, that's, from what I've seen, one of the biggest dividing factors in people that, at least that I see, that I respect versus the ones I don't respect, is, were their parents, who are their parents, huge. It's huge. And unfortunately, we don't get to pick.
Mm-hmm.
But I think that's something that's not talked about enough today.
I think you're right. It's not talked about enough today. One question I do have is, if you see that happening, do you have an obligation to take action?
If you see parents that aren't living up to what they should be doing, being a good influence on their children?
Yes, if you see parents who are being a directly bad influence on their children, or there is an absence of a parent, or if there is per se a conflict between the two parents, do you have the obligation to step in? Is that something that should be delegated to the relatives? Is that something that society needs to take care of?
I would say you have an obligation to be the best influence you can be. Now, at the end of the day, right, they're not your kids. They're not your kids. They're someone else's kids. And how much authority you can offer, maybe you can't stop the parents from parenting the kids the way they are, and you can try, but maybe they're, at the end of the day, it's their kids, and if they want, they can even pack up and move out of state. you're obligated to try and be the best influence you can. Now, like, what type of relationship do you have with them? If the parents are your friends, maybe the farthest you can take the influence is like, hey, explain this to me, and just sit there and try and listen to what they're going through and why they're raising the kids they are, and try and offer them advice. Maybe it's your kids parenting children. Well, maybe then you might be called to be like, hey, look, you cannot raise my grandchildren like this. This is wrong. And, take it to them, I guess, so to speak, and maybe take further action. Maybe if you have the authority to, and it's necessary. I'm shooting way out of my game because I'm just a little punk, barely not a teenager, but, maybe there's a situation, and I don't know, where you should try and assume the role as the parent, for the sake of the children.
I mean, hypothetically, if both parents are drug addicts and you see that it's going to happen to the child if the child continues to be exposed to that behavior, especially at a young age, then I would say you do have the obligation to step in and do something about it.
Well, yeah, and I would agree that especially if you're related to the person, there should be some intervention there of some sort. I remember there was at my graduation, and yes, I did graduate from high school. That surprisingly, I know, that the speaker talked about two twins, or not two twins, one set of twins, and their father was a drunk, and it was just a really bad home life for him, and that's the way the children happen to grow up with this great influence. I meant that tongue in cheek. He was not a great. He was great as being poor influence, a bad influence. And so the children grew up, and they moved apart, and at some time in their life, one of them was a very well successful business person, a good family, everything else like that, and so asked why, how is it that you got to be like this? And he said, well, you should have seen where I grew up from. You should have seen the family life that I had. It was with that type of influence, I was not going to go through that again. However, his twin, just like his dad, what do you expect with that type of influence that I had? So there's two ways of looking at it, and not necessarily saying that everyone's going to turn out like the guy who looked at the bad and said, I don't want that. I'm going to do something else. Right? Mm-hmm. So, and I'm not saying that you have a 50% chance of making it out of your childhood alive and with a good influence. I'm not saying that either, but a lot of it has to do with the individual person and where their aspirations lie. Given that scenario where I just pointed out, because you're not going to be able to save everybody, and you definitely can't ask the government to do it. You ask for it. What do you leave it up to society to help? Mm-hmm. I think it's a very poor choice, at least on a federal level, and on a very local level. That's where the problem should be. First, it starts at home, and then with the family, then with your local societal portions, such as your township or your county, your city. Mm-hmm. Not on a federal level. Should never get to that point, and not even to the state level. Anyway, you want me to knock off something?
Well, I think that's a pretty good point that we can wrap up on. We talked about a lot this episode, and we might have a part 2 if you'd be willing to come back.
Oh, I appreciate that very much. That sounds like a spectacular idea.
Very well, then. In this episode, we talked about influence. In greater detail, we talked about why influence is relevant today, whether you should try to influence others, and whether you should let others influence you. We defined influence and also talked about how to look at influencing others and whether to look at it in a positive or negative way. When looking at good and bad influence, we defined it as good influence does no harm, and that bad influence hinders good influence and hinders good behavior. We talked about how to stop bad influences in personal scenarios and in family scenarios. We talked quite extensively about influencing your children and your family, about how the influences that you have on your children in the first 5 years are very formative influences. And we also spoke about some ways of influencing others, such as leading by example or manipulating or motivating others or incentivizing them. We talked about how good influences can seem like they are difficult to hear and can hurt sometimes to hear them. And on that same track, we talked about how bad influences can be pleasant to hear almost in a way that it can be easier to accept a bad influence than to seek out good influences. And finally, we talked about how you should act if you see someone being a bad influence, especially in the family setting. If you see a parent being a bad influence to a child, or if you see maybe a family member being a bad influence on one of their siblings or perhaps even a grandchild. I would like to personally thank Mr. Michael Schoech for coming on this episode and for agreeing to
All right, you're welcome. It was my pleasure. I appreciate that.
Thank you very much.
Yes, thank you, Dad. I'm happy that you came down here and were willing to share your wisdom, and I hope to see you for our part 2. Just as a little sneak peek, in our next part, we want to talk about the unique influence a man can have over a woman and a woman can have over a man. We want to talk about the type of people you should surround yourself with. What should your friend group be, you know? You are the sum of the 5 people you spend the most time with. And then we wanted to talk about societal influence, namely social media, entertainment, and a few other things. We thank you guys for listening, and we would love to hear any thoughts or comments you had on the show, any ideas about this episode, or ideas for future topics. All right. Thank you, and goodbye.
One last note. Please share your thoughts and comments to the email address @therootofknowledge@gmail.com. Thank you.